Okay, welcome to this explainer. It's honestly hard to imagine now, but back in 1950s Britain, a brief, highly spirited DIY craze completely democratized music and actually birthed some of the greatest rock legends in history. Today, we're tracing the origins of a movement that proved you really don't need a lot of money to make a massive impact. Let's dive in and explore a moment in time when a single spark ignited a cultural explosion that changed the trajectory of popular music forever. Think about rock and roll today. We instantly picture what? Massive stadium tours, blinding light shows, and electric guitars that cost an absolute fortune, right? But long before the era of giant arena shows and polished studio gear, a true musical revolution was actually powered by the absolute cheapest household items imaginable: washboards and tea chests. It was a time when the barrier to entry wasn't landing a fancy record deal, but simply having the willingness to make some noise with whatever you had lying around the house. To really wrap our heads around this revolution, we gotta look at the environment it sprang from. Mid-1950s post-WW2 Britain was, well, a pretty tough, gray place. The country was still heavily immersed in the difficult process of recovery. Money was incredibly tight for the average family, and opportunities for young people were pretty much strictly limited. But right in the middle of all that severe economic hardship, teenagers were just desperate for their own voice. They wanted their own distinct culture and a thrilling sound they could actually call their own, entirely separate from their parents' generation. And the answer to that profound cultural desperation was a simple, highly rebellious, and totally organic movement. So, what exactly is Skiffle? It's a genre name that's kind of faded into the background today, obviously overshadowed by the massive rock and roll acts that followed it. But for a few glorious, chaotic years in the 1950s, it was the absolute center of the youth universe. Basically, Skiffle was this wildly accessible musical hybrid. It mashed up American folk, blues, jazz, and country music, but stripped it down to its absolute simplest, rawest form. It completely ditched the pristine polish and intimidating complexity of big band jazz or classical music. What was left? Just an incredibly infectious rhythm and a driving melody that literally anyone could naturally tap their foot to. Now, traditional brass or string instruments were way too expensive for average teenagers to afford, so these kids had to get incredibly creative. They'd grab cheap secondhand acoustic guitars and pair them with literal household junk to create their driving rhythm. We are talking about ordinary kitchen spoons clacked together, glass jugs, heavily corrugated washboards played with actual thimbles, and, oh man, the legendary tea chest bass. That was literally just a hollow wooden shipping box with a broomstick and a single piece of string attached to it. You just plucked it to create a deep, thumping bass line. Section 1. The 1956 Spark. But, a pile of dry wood and household junk is exactly that, until something finally sets it off. For British youth, that massive, undeniable spark arrived in 1956 with a guy named Lonnie Donegan. He released a fast-paced, relentlessly driving track called Rock Island Line. It wasn't polished, and it certainly wasn't fancy, but it had this raw, frantic, almost unhinged energy that just shattered the slow, conservative musical status quo of the time. It felt incredibly real and completely accessible. It was, quite simply, a jolt of pure electricity straight into the culture. The song became a massive UK hit practically overnight, selling millions of copies. Suddenly, you had thousands of teenagers sitting wide-eyed by their radios having this immediate, highly empowering realization. Wait, if he can do it, so can I. Lonnie Donegan didn't sound like a distant, untouchable, manufactured pop star. He sounded like a regular guy just playing his absolute heart out. He made making music feel genuinely achievable to absolutely everyone listening. And what followed Donegan's musical spark was a total cultural explosion. Within just 1 year of that single song's release, an astonishing 30,000 skiffle groups formed all across Britain. I mean, think about that sheer scale for a second. 30,000 new bands springing up practically overnight in a country that previously had almost zero grassroots youth music scene at all. The reaction was entirely unprecedented. It was a true grassroots DIY revolution. Teenagers suddenly realized they didn't need permission from adults, teachers, or powerful record labels. They didn't need money, and they definitely didn't need years of grueling formal training to create music that actually mattered. They just turned their local schools, their parents' drafty garages, and cramped living rooms into makeshift, high-energy rehearsal spaces. The only actual requirement to join the movement? Pure, unadulterated passion. Section 2. Training Ground for Legends. Now, This is where the story of Skiffle shifts dramatically from a fun, fleeting cultural fad into a massive pivot in global music history. It's the ultimate ripple effect stemming directly from Lonnie Donegan's spark. A young, fiercely rebellious teenager named John Lennon formed a skiffle group called the Quarrymen. Soon after, another teenager named Paul McCartney watched them play a local gig and joined up. Then, a young George Harrison joined the band. Over a few years, that little skiffle group, initially playing on cheap, rudimentary instruments, evolved into, you guessed it, the Beatles. And the movement certainly didn't just forge the Beatles. Massive guitar icons, people we completely revere today as absolute musical masters, like Led Zeppelin's Jimmy Page and the legendary Eric Clapton, were also deeply inspired by this early, incredibly scrappy DIY era. Skiffle was quite literally the essential training ground for the entire generation of musicians that would go on to totally conquer the musical world in the 1960s. Section 3. The enduring DIY legacy. Of course, nothing lasts forever, right? By the early 1960s, real electric guitars became much more accessible, rock and roll fully took over the charts, and the skiffle craze itself began to slowly disappear from the mainstream consciousness. But skiffle didn't fail, it just beautifully evolved. Its impact was permanent. It proved once and for all that you don't need expensive gear to start making art. It effectively transformed an entire generation of passive radio listeners into bold, confident, and prolific creators. It firmly laid the foundation for modern pop and rock culture. And its remarkable DIY spirit, that lives on today in ways those 1950s kids couldn't have even imagined. It's heavily present in every garage band rehearsing on a weekend, every fiercely independent indie artist pushing their own unique sound, and every modern bedroom producer quietly making massive beats on a laptop. The tools have evolved, from washboards to software, but the fundamental, rebellious spirit of the movement is exactly the same. At the end of the day, music is fundamentally about raw expression, not perfection. It's about having something to say and finding a way to say it, regardless of the limitations around you. Skiffle brilliantly proved that sometimes all it takes to change everything, to completely shift the entire culture of a nation and eventually the world, is just a hollow wooden box, a single piece of string, and a dream. So, knowing that the greatest and most influential music revolution of the 20th century started with nothing but raw passion and a few basic household items, what will you create with your box and string?